The first time I heard about the thing in the woods, I didn't believe it. People in town called it a tall tale, something that hunters whispered about to keep kids from wandering too far from camp. They said it had been seen for decades, something long and lean that slipped between trees without a sound, with eyes that caught the moonlight like wet glass. But I thought it was just one of those stories people passed down until the story itself was older than anyone left to tell it. It wasn't until last October, when the leaves had turned to fire and the air carried that sharp bite of the coming winter, that I found myself face to face with the truth. I had driven up north to stay at my uncle's cabin, a place tucked deep into the backcountry, where cell service dropped out 5 miles before the dirt road even began. He used to hunt there when I was a kid, but after his heart gave out, the cabin was left to gather dust. I thought a week alone in the woods would be peaceful, a chance to reset, to get away from the endless noise of the city. But peace was the last thing I found. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, started a fire in the old stone fireplace, and sat listening to the crickets and the occasional far-off call of an owl. The forest was alive with noise, but it was a familiar noise, the kind you could fall asleep to. I thought about the local stories then, laughing to myself, imagining some drunk hunter mistaking a deer in the moonlight for a monster. It seemed ridiculous until the second night. I had been sitting on the porch with a flashlight and a book, trying to read by the dim yellow beam when I heard it. Not an animal sound, not steady hoot of an owl or the skitter of raccoons, but something else. A low hum, almost like a voice, carrying just enough tone to seem intentional. It came from the tree line about 40 yards away. I shut the book and froze. The hum rose and fell, faint but steady, almost like words spoken too quietly to understand. My first thought was that someone was out there, maybe another hunter, maybe some trespasser wandering close. But who would be walking the woods in pitch black with no light? I raised the flashlight, shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the branches, catching only swaying leaves. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was too sharp, too sudden, as if the forest itself was listening. I called out, "Hello?" But my own voice sounded small, foolish against the looming woods. Nothing answered. I tried to laugh it off, went back inside and locked the door. But sleep didn't come easy. The sound stayed with me, that strange, almost human murmur. By the third night, I wasn't laughing. Around midnight, something tapped against the cabin wall. Not a knock, not a branch swaying in the wind, but a sharp, deliberate tap, 3 times, evenly spaced. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I didn't move for a long time, waiting for it to come again. When it finally did, I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. At first, I saw nothing but my own pale reflection in the glass. Then, just as I was about to step back, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A shape, taller than any man I'd ever seen, stood between the trunks, motionless, just barely visible in the weak light of the moon. My breath caught in my throat. Its arms were too long, its body thin and unnatural, and though its face was obscured by shadow, I could see the faint gleam of eyes watching me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, staring at it. Then, as if it realized I'd seen it, the thing shifted. Its head tilted, almost curious, and then it stepped backward into the darkness until it vanished completely. I stumbled away from the window, my pulse hammering, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the flashlight. The silence outside pressed against the cabin walls like a weight. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I told myself I must have imagined it, a trick of the shadows in my exhausted mind. But when I went outside, I saw the ground beneath the window. The soil was disturbed, flattened by something heavy. And there were impressions, long, narrow prints, deeper than any deer or bear could make, leading back into the forest. I should have packed my bags that morning and left, but something about those prints gnawed at me, pulling me deeper into a curiosity I didn't want to admit I had. They weren't normal tracks, not shaped like hooves or paws, but elongated impressions with odd spacing, as if whatever had stood there didn't walk the way we do. I counted 5 on one side, 5 on the other, almost like a stretched hand pressed into the earth, though far too large for any person. The rational part of my mind told me it had to be some warped animal print, maybe eroded by rain. But there hadn't been any rain in days. The woods around the cabin were silent as I studied them. Too silent. Normally the mornings rang with birds, insects, the chatter of small animals. But that day, I heard nothing except the wind moving gently through the trees, and even that felt muted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself, chopping firewood, sweeping the cabin, anything to keep from staring into the tree line. But every time I looked up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, pack the truck, and forget I'd ever seen those eyes. But when the sun went down, when the last light drained from the sky and the cabin sank into shadow, I realized I was already too late. The night crept in thicker than before, darker somehow, and when I lit the oil lamp on the table, its glow seemed to fall short of the corners of the room. I cooked a quick dinner, forcing myself to eat, though I had no appetite, and tried to drown out the silence by reading again. The fire cracked and hissed in the hearth, but the sound felt thin, useless against the pressing weight outside. Sometime past midnight, the humming returned, faint at first, low and steady, rising and falling like a voice just below the edge of hearing. My skin crawled as I set the book aside, straining to listen. It wasn't coming from one direction this time. It seemed to seep through the walls, curling around me no matter where I turned. I killed the lamp and crouched by the window, heart thudding, eyes fixed on the tree line. The humming stopped. For a long moment, the forest was dead still. Then something moved between the trees. Not fast, not clumsy, but deliberate. Tall, spindly shapes swayed just past the reach of the moonlight, too thin for tree trunks, too fluid for branches. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. The shape shifted, and then I saw it again. The figure, the same impossible tallness, the same gleam of reflective eyes. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another shape stood beside it. Then, another. My mouth went dry as I counted 3, maybe 4 of them, just at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move closer, didn't rush the cabin like something animal would. They just watched, heads tilted at unnatural angles, as if studying me. The urge to run, to slam the curtain shut and hide under the bed like a child, nearly overwhelmed me. But I forced myself to stay still, praying they would lose interest and leave. For what felt like hours, they didn't budge, just those gleaming eyes catching every flicker of moonlight, unblinking. Eventually, the forest shifted, the sound of an owl calling far away, the wind moving through branches. And when I dared look back, they were gone. The clearing was empty. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking, sweat cold on my skin. My thoughts spun, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but nothing fit. These weren't hunters, not pranksters in costumes. No one could move like that, stand like that, or hum with voices that made the air itself feel heavy. I barely slept, and when I did drift off, I dreamt of long arms reaching through the window, pulling me into a dark forest where dozens of those glassy eyes blinked open in unison. When morning came, I staggered outside, desperate to prove to myself it hadn't been real. But the soil in front of the cabin was disturbed again, more heavily this time, with dozens of prints overlapping each other like a chaotic pattern pressed into the dirt. They hadn't just stood there. They had surrounded the cabin. By the third morning, the unease had settled so deeply into me that even daylight didn't bring relief. I moved through the cabin like a trespasser, as though the place no longer belonged to me, but to whatever had stood outside all night, watching. I didn't make breakfast, couldn't keep food down, and every sound, every groan of the wood, every whisper of wind through the chimney, set my nerves on edge. My plan was simple: survive one more night, leave at first light, and never come back. But the forest had other intentions. It began with the knocking. In the late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I heard it again. 3 hard taps against the wall, exactly like before. I rushed to the window, flashlight ready, but nothing stirred outside. I waited, breath caught, until it came again, this time from the opposite wall, as though something circled the cabin with purpose. I bolted the door, checked the shutters twice, and forced myself to sit still. But the knocks followed me, moving from wall to wall, sometimes near the roof, sometimes low against the foundation. It wasn't the random noise of branches or animals. It was deliberate, patient, testing me. When darkness finally swallowed the clearing, the knocks ceased. For a moment, I thought it was over, until I heard the slow drag of something heavy along the porch, like fingers trailing across the wood. I crept to the front door, every instinct screaming at me to stay back, but I had to see. Through a narrow slit in the curtain, I caught a glimpse. Long, pale digits curling slowly around the edge of the door frame, impossibly thin and jointed in ways no human hand should be. They lingered there, tapping lightly as though feeling the grain of the wood before sliding out of view. My knees nearly gave way. I backed into the room, clutching the fireplace poker like it could make any difference. Hours crawled by with me sitting in the center of the cabin, waiting. At some point, the humming began again, louder than before, coming not from outside but within the walls themselves, as if the cabin was a hollow instrument and they were plucking its strings. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it seeped through, rising and falling in a mockery of language. Then, the unmistakable sound of the latch at the back door lifting. My blood turned to ice. I ran to it, shoving the bolt back into place just as the door began to give. Something pulled once, hard enough to make the frame groan, then let go. I waited, trembling, listening to silence return like a tide receding. The hours that followed dragged on endlessly, filled with tiny scratches at the windows, faint taps on the roof, and the sense that 100 unseen eyes pressed against the cabin. When dawn finally broke, the relief was so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. But daylight brought no safety, only evidence. Around the cabin, the ground was pocked with dozens of new impressions, those same stretched hand-like prints pressed into the soil. They traced paths circling the cabin, overlapping, crowding close to the door, even beneath the windows. I followed one trail to the tree line, where the prints simply stopped as though the creatures had lifted themselves into the air. My thoughts twisted with questions I couldn't answer. What were they? Why were they circling me? What would happen if I stayed another night? I should have left then, packed the truck, and driven until the forest was a memory. But something in me, some sick fascination, some desperate need to understand, chained me there. As I stood in the clearing, staring at the tracks that ended in nothing, I realized I wasn't afraid of dying in those woods. I was afraid of not knowing what hunted me. I don't know what drove me to do it, exhaustion, curiosity, or the sickening pull of madness. But by late afternoon, I found myself following the trail of those warped impressions into the woods. I told myself I only wanted proof, something tangible to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't stand being watched anymore without understanding by what. The prints wove between the trees, each one pressed deep into the soil with a weight that suggested something enormous, though the narrowness of them contradicted the size. They bent at strange angles, sometimes climbing over roots or stones without breaking stride, as if the thing that made them didn't care about obstacles. I walked with the poker clutched in my hand, every step whispering that I should turn back, but I pressed on until the trees thickened around me and the clearing disappeared behind a curtain of trunks. That's when I saw the first mark. High on the bark of an oak, far above my reach, was a gouge, 4 deep parallel scratches carved into the wood, curling slightly upward like the impression of an enormous hand dragged across it. The wound in the tree looked fresh, sap bleeding down its side. My stomach turned, but I moved closer, tracing the groove with trembling fingers. Whatever made it was tall, taller than any man alive. I began noticing more as I walked, cuts and carvings in the trees that at first looked random but soon revealed a pattern. They weren't just scratches. They were deliberate, almost symbols, though crude and alien. Circles intersected by jagged lines, crude humanoid shapes bent at odd angles, and spirals that seemed to spin no matter how long I looked at them. The forest grew unnervingly quiet as I studied them, so quiet that even my own breath sounded like an intrusion. Then came the smell. It drifted on the air, subtle at first, then stronger. The stench of rot, wet earth, and old meat left to spoil. I followed it against my better judgment until the trees thinned into a shallow hollow. At its center lay the carcass of a deer, torn open with its ribcage spread wide like a grotesque book. But what froze me wasn't the gore. It was the way the remains had been arranged. The bones weren't scattered by scavengers, but stacked, lined carefully along the ground in spirals echoing the carvings on the trees. The skull had been placed upright at the spiral's heart, empty sockets staring skyward. My knees nearly gave out as bile rose in my throat, but even as horror churned inside me, a terrible clarity settled in. These weren't just hunters. They were ritualists. Whatever lived in these woods wasn't feeding for survival. It was arranging, marking, shaping something I couldn't begin to understand. I backed away, every instinct screaming to run. But as I turned, the humming started again. Not faint, not distant this time, but close. So close it vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. My head snapped up, and at the far rim of the hollow, between 2 pines, stood one of them. Tall, too tall, its limbs impossibly stretched, its body narrow and swaying like a reed in windless air. Its head was cocked, as if curious, and though the shadows masked its face, I knew it was watching. My legs refused to move. I stood there, shaking, while the humming deepened, joined by another voice, then another, until the entire forest seemed alive with it. The creature raised one long arm and pressed its fingers flat against a tree, dragging them slowly down the bark with a sound like nails on stone. Then, in a movement so smooth it was almost unreal, it stepped backward and vanished into the gloom, the humming fading with it. I ran then, sprinting through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes, not daring to look behind me. I didn't stop until the cabin burst into view, a fragile haven in the dying light. My chest heaved, my vision swam, but one truth rooted itself deeper than the fear. They weren't just watching, they were showing me something, and I didn't know if it was a warning or an invitation. Sleep became impossible after that night, not only because of the sounds outside, but because of what filled my mind when I closed my eyes, the spirals of bone, the carved symbols, the way that towering figure had simply observed me as though I were the one trespassing. My body ached with fatigue, but fear made me restless, pacing the cabin floor until the boards groaned under my weight. That morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, I searched the cabin for anything that might help me understand what was happening. The place had been in my uncle's family for decades, handed down from his father, and I wondered if someone before me had noticed these things, left behind something I had missed. My search led me to the crawl space beneath the floorboards, a damp and narrow gap filled with dust, mouse droppings, and boxes of old tools. It was while dragging one of those boxes out that my hand brushed against a warped wooden crate shoved deep into the corner. It was smaller than the others and sealed with rusted nails, the wood blackened with age. I pried it open with the poker, and inside I found a stack of notebooks, their covers cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside was cramped, uneven, scrawled in pencil that had faded to gray, but it was legible. The earliest entries dated back to the 1960s, written by a man named Elias, who I realized must have been the cabin's first owner. At first, the notes were mundane: weather reports, hunting successes, repairs to the cabin. But after a few months, the tone changed. Elias began writing about the tall ones. He described seeing them at night among the trees, their eyes reflecting firelight, their bodies too thin and too long. He wrote of the humming, of knocks at the cabin walls, of prints in the soil. His words were frantic, broken at times as though he wrote while shaking. One passage in particular froze me. They do not come for food. They do not come for shelter. They come because they want you to see. They want you to know them. My skin crawled as I read on. Elias claimed the creatures were ancient, older than the forest itself, and that they moved between places, appearing where the land was thinnest, where people lingered too long in solitude. He wrote of how they circled him for weeks, never attacking, only watching, until one night he awoke in the woods with no memory of leaving his bed. From that night onward, his journal became incoherent, filled with spirals, scratched words, and frantic warnings scrawled over entire pages. Do not look at their faces. Do not follow their songs. Do not let them touch you. The final entry was dated in 1968, and after that, the notebook ended abruptly. No explanation, no conclusion, just silence. I sat there with the journal in my lap, heart pounding, unable to shake the thought that my uncle must have known. Maybe he found these books himself and chose never to speak of them. Maybe he thought leaving the cabin empty was the only way to break the chain. But now I was here, and the chain had looped around me. I shoved the notebooks back into the crate and pushed it under the bed, as though hiding them could undo what I'd read. But the words clung to me, their weight pressing against every corner of my mind. That night I kept the fireplace roaring, every lamp burning, as though light alone could keep them at bay. For hours nothing happened, the forest still and empty, until just past 2 in the morning I heard it again. The humming, but different this time. It wasn't distant or muffled, not resonating from the walls. It came from above me, from the roof. I froze, every muscle taut, listening as the weight of footsteps shifted overhead, slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. Dust drifted down from the rafters with each step. Then a second set joined it, then a third, until it sounded like a congregation pacing in unison, circling above. My lungs burned as I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of it might draw their attention. The humming grew louder, overlapping voices weaving in and out of each other. Not quite music, not quite speech. I couldn't move, couldn't think, only sit there paralyzed until, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The weight lifted, The cabin creaked in relief, and silence returned. But when dawn came, I stepped outside to find the roof streaked with long, dark smears, as though something with too many fingers had dragged itself across the shingles in the night. The next day, I forced myself to work, if only to keep my hands busy and my mind from circling back to the journals and the things that had walked across the roof. I chopped wood until my arms shook, swept the porch, even cleaned out the fireplace, though it didn't need it. Anything to feel like I still had some measure of control over my life. By late afternoon, I was sweating despite the chill in the air, and for a few brief hours I convinced myself that maybe the night before had been nothing more than exhaustion twisting my senses. Maybe I had been dreaming, half asleep, imagining footsteps overhead while my mind lingered on Elias's frantic words. That fragile hope carried me into the evening. But as dusk bled into night, the silence of the forest reminded me that denial was nothing but another kind of madness. The woods should have been alive with the chirr of insects, the distant call of owls, but they weren't. They hadn't been for nights now. The absence pressed on me like a weight. Every quiet moment another reminder that something beyond the ordinary had claimed the land. I barricaded the doors and windows again, double-checked the bolts, and sat with the poker across my knees in the center of the cabin, every lamp lit. Hours passed without incident until I heard the faint rattle of glass. My heart stuttered. Slowly, carefully, I turned toward the small window above the kitchen counter. At first, I thought it was the wind shaking the glass, but the air was still, not a whisper stirring the trees outside. The rattle came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't shaking, it was tapping. A slow, steady tap from the other side, each one separated by a long pause. I rose, poker in hand, and inched toward the window, pulse hammering. The curtain shifted slightly as if touched by a draft, though no air moved inside. I reached out with trembling fingers and tugged it aside. The glass reflected the lamps behind me, but past the glare I could make out the pale outline of a hand, if you could call it that. The digits were impossibly long, jointed too many times, pressed flat against the pane like someone testing the barrier between us. I froze, locked in that grotesque tableau, until the hand slid upward and vanished into darkness. I staggered back, nearly dropping the poker, when another sound rose from outside. The crunch of footsteps, many footsteps, moving in unison around the cabin. They were slow, measured, as if pacing a circle. I shut off the lamps one by one until only the fire remained, praying that darkness might make them lose interest. But the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for hours, circling, sometimes breaking into uneven patterns as if one of them darted closer only to retreat again. The air grew heavy with that low hum, faint at first, then stronger, until it reverberated in my chest. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. It was inside me, a vibration in the marrow of my bones. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell. The footsteps stopped. The humming ceased. I sat there rigid, every muscle tense, until the fire burned low and exhaustion dragged at my eyes. Against my better judgment, I dozed off in the chair. I woke at dawn to a thin gray light seeping through the windows and an unshakable dread. Stepping outside, I found the clearing marred with dozens of overlapping impressions, pressed so close to the walls that I could see the drag marks of fingers trailing across the logs. They had encircled the cabin all night, pressing in, and I knew in my gut that if the walls hadn't been there, I would have been taken. Yet what chilled me most wasn't the tracks or the scratches. It was the single object left on the porch, a small spiral of stones, carefully arranged, identical to the ones I had seen in the hollow around the deer's carcass. It hadn't been there before. They hadn't just been circling me, they were leaving messages. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The spirals, the symbols, the way they circled me like some kind of ritual. The journals had warned me. Elias had written in frantic scrawl that they wanted us to know them. And now I understood what he meant. They weren't just tormenting me for sport. They were trying to show me something, to teach me in a language of stone, bone, and silence. That thought gnawed at me all day as I paced the clearing, eyes darting constantly to the tree line. I wanted to leave, to flee down that dirt road and never look back. But every time I thought of it, a tightness gripped my chest, as if the forest itself had wrapped chains around me. It wasn't just fear, it was compulsion, a sick hunger to see what they would do next. By the time night fell, my nerves were frayed, my stomach empty, though I hadn't noticed my own hunger until then. I stoked the fire, locked the doors, checked the bolts, but a part of me knew none of it mattered. When they wanted to come in, they would. Hours passed in silence, and I began to think maybe I'd have a reprieve. Then I heard it. My name. Not loud, not screamed, but whispered, soft as a sigh. It came from outside the window nearest my bed. Daniel. The sound froze me to the core. It was my mother's voice, down to the lilt, the warmth, the exact tone she used when waking me as a child. My mother had been dead for 3 years. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite side of the cabin, drifting through the cracks in the wood. Daniel, come out. My throat closed as I clutched the poker, whispering to myself that it wasn't her, couldn't be her. The journals had warned me, do not follow their songs, do not listen to their voices. And now I understood why. They weren't just humming anymore. They were speaking, using the memory of the dead like bait. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice still curled inside my head, coaxing, soothing, as though it were bypassing sound entirely. I shouted for it to stop, the words trembling, but that only seemed to make it stronger. Soon other voices joined it, all familiar, all wrong. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years, my uncle who had died in that very cabin, even my own voice echoing back at me from outside, each one calling in perfect unison. Daniel, come out. I stumbled backward until I hit the far wall, shaking violently. The voices repeated over and over, sometimes overlapping, sometimes stretching into distorted sing-song, but always with that same coaxing pull. When I dared glance out the window, I saw them. Tall, spindly figures lined along the tree line, motionless, their heads tilted toward the cabin. Though I couldn't see their mouths in the dark, I knew the voices were coming from them. I don't know how long it went on, minutes, hours, but eventually the chorus faded, replaced once again by the dreadful silence. When morning came, I forced myself outside, praying that daylight might reveal nothing, that maybe I had hallucinated the whole ordeal. But in the soft earth by the porch steps, I found words pressed into the soil, not carved, not written with tools, but imprinted as though by fingers dragging through dirt. Come out. Each letter was nearly 2 feet tall, jagged, uneven, gouged deep into the ground. My stomach turned as I realized they hadn't just been calling to me. They had been waiting for me to answer. I told myself I would leave that morning, that I would gather my things, load the truck, and drive until the trees gave way to open sky. But when I set out down the dirt road, the world betrayed me. The path wound the way I remembered for the first mile, curving through birch and pine, the air sharp with cold. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look into the forest on either side for fear of what I might see watching. But as I walked, The trees thickened unnaturally, crowding closer until the path itself seemed to narrow. At first I thought I had taken a wrong turn, yet the wheel ruts were still there beneath my boots. Another mile passed, and still I hadn't reached the split where the road dipped toward the creek. Instead, the path bent back upon itself, leading me to a clearing I knew well, the cabin's clearing. I stopped dead, lungs seizing. I had walked straight and steady, never once turned back. But here I was, staring at the cabin from the opposite side of the yard. My mind scrambled for explanations, fatigue, disorientation, the sameness of the forest tricking me. But deep down, I knew. They weren't letting me leave. My legs trembled as I stumbled back inside, slamming the door, bolting it as though it mattered. I sat on the floor with my head in my hands, fighting the growing weight of dread. Hours bled together as I tried to convince myself I would try again tomorrow, that this was some bizarre mistake. But night came regardless, and with it, the voices. They didn't whisper this time. They laughed. A low, broken imitation of human laughter, echoing just beyond the walls, circling the cabin like a pack of hyenas. Sometimes it was high-pitched, almost childlike, sometimes guttural and harsh, but always wrong, always hollow, as though they had heard laughter once and were trying to reconstruct it without understanding what it meant. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound drilled through me until it was vibrating in my teeth. Then, amid the laughter, I heard my own voice again, clear, sharp, calling from just outside the back door. "Daniel, open the door. It's safe now." I nearly broke then, nearly believed it, because it was so perfect. Every cadence, every inflection exactly my own. I even found myself halfway across the room before the journal screamed back into my memory. "Do not let them touch you." I froze, chest heaving, staring at the latch as my own voice repeated itself again and again. "Open the door. It's safe now. Open the door." The laughter rose in unison with it, a hideous chorus, until the cabin seemed to shake with sound. I gritted my teeth, dropped to the floor, and crawled beneath the bed like a child, poker clutched tight to my chest. I stayed there all night, the voices battering the walls, the laughter peeling into shrieks and then falling silent again, over and over in cruel waves. When dawn came, the forest was quiet once more, but outside the cabin the ground bore fresh marks, circles within circles, spirals drawn not in stone this time, but in the soil itself, gouged deep like furrows from plows. And in the center of the largest spiral, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My boot, one of mine ripped from the porch, its laces torn free, resting neatly at the spiral's heart. I hadn't even heard them take it. They were showing me again that nothing in the cabin was safe, that even the smallest boundary I clung to meant nothing to them. I could no longer tell how many days had passed. The light seemed thinner, the forest denser, as though the world beyond the cabin had been swallowed and replaced by some living nightmare. Each attempt to leave ended the same. The road bent, twisted, and returned me to the clearing, as though the forest itself had learned to fold space around me. I stopped trying to resist. Instead, I began to watch, to study the spirals, the carved symbols, the arrangements of stones and bones that proliferated around the cabin. One morning, or what I thought was morning, the ground beneath the porch bore a new message, this one larger than any before, a long, jagged spiral of dirt and stones leading from the tree line into the woods. Trembling, I followed it, telling myself that understanding was worth the risk. The forest closed in immediately, the trees arching unnaturally overhead, their branches like grasping fingers, and the air grew thick with that sickly, organic scent I had come to associate with them. The spiral led me deeper than I had ever dared go, past familiar landmarks into a part of the woods that should not have existed. Here, the ground was littered with bones, not scattered but arranged in long, meticulous rows. Deer, small mammals, even fragments that suggested human remains, though I forced myself not to dwell on that possibility. At the center of this horrific display, I found a stone altar of sorts, flat and worn, with jagged symbols carved into the surface, echoing the spirals I had seen everywhere else. My stomach churned, but I could not look away. And then I heard it, a soft hum rising from the stones themselves. I froze as the hum grew, layering over itself, shifting in pitch until it became more than a sound. It was a presence. From the shadows, they appeared. Not one or two, but dozens towering figures emerging from the trees like ghosts of warped wood. They didn't walk, they glided, their long limbs bending impossibly, each step silent as fog drifting over the earth. They surrounded the clearing, tilting their heads in unison, observing me without fear or malice, only intent. I realized then that the voices, the laughter, the mimicry, all of it had been preparation, a careful teaching. They were showing me the patterns of their world, the spirals, the arrangements, the very geometry of their existence. One approached the altar and pressed its impossibly long fingers to the stone, tracing the carvings with deliberate slowness. The symbols glowed faintly where it touched, the air vibrating in response, and I understood without knowing how that they were communicating, not with words, but with shapes and intention. I stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the comprehension of something far older and stranger than human imagination. And then I saw it, a spiral forming from the shadows themselves, coiling and uncoiling as if breathing. The creatures began to hum in perfect synchrony, the sound rising and falling like a living tide, carrying a rhythm that made the blood in my veins thrum. One of them tilted its head toward me, and I could have sworn I felt a faint tug in my mind, a pull as though it wanted me to step forward, to join the ritual, to leave the bounds of humanity behind. I resisted, forcing myself to turn and run, though the forest had no exit for me. Every tree I tried to pass bent impossibly. Every familiar landmark shifted. And then, from the periphery of my vision, I saw movement not from the creatures themselves, but from the forest, twisted shadows curling and stretching, forming shapes that were not trees, not animals, not anything I could name. They pressed toward me, guiding me, or perhaps warning me. I could not tell. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I ran until I stumbled into a hollow where the ground fell away into a small depression, and I finally dared to look back. The creatures had gathered around the altar again, the spiral of stones and bones spinning slowly, impossibly, as if alive. I thought of the journal, of Elias's final entries, and a horrifying realization struck. I was not witnessing a hunt, a game, or a test. I was part of their world now, an observer trapped in a lesson I didn't fully understand. And in that moment, I knew that whatever was coming next, I would not leave unchanged, because these things had already touched my mind, had already inscribed their language into my thoughts, had already begun to claim me in ways I could not fight. I can't describe how I found the courage to move deeper into the woods that night, only that some part of me understood I could no longer hide in the cabin, no longer cling to safety behind walls of wood and glass. The spirals and patterns had led me here, and I knew I had to see it through, to witness what these things wanted me to witness, or be consumed by my own fear for eternity. The forest was darker than ever, thicker, suffocating. Every branch seemed to bend toward me, Every shadow coiled like a living thing. The spirals of stones and soil appeared again, winding and overlapping, leading me through the trees like a road paved in madness. I heard the hum before I saw them, low and resonant, rising and falling in waves that made the hair on my arms stand on end. And then I saw them. They emerged from the shadows with a fluid grace, dozens of figures, impossibly tall, thin, stretching far beyond what a human body could allow, their limbs bending at angles that made my mind recoil. They circled the clearing like predators, but there was no aggression in their movements, only observation, intent, the same feeling I had known since the first night. I froze, clutching the poker as if it could ward off this impossible presence. One of them approached the center of the clearing, where the largest spiral of stones, bones, and dirt twisted like a vortex. Its fingers brushed the altar, and the symbols carved into the stone seemed to ripple beneath its touch, faintly glowing as though charged with some unknowable energy. Then they began to hum together, perfectly synchronized, the sound carrying a rhythm that pressed against my bones, against my skull, weaving into my thoughts until I felt the pulse of it inside me, like my heartbeat was no longer my own. Another of the creatures tilted its head and pointed a long, slender finger toward me. I stumbled backward, terrified, yet compelled, a magnetic pull I could not resist dragging me forward, closer to the spiral, closer to the center where the rhythm was strongest. The voices came next, layered and distorted, some mimicking my own words, others twisting the tones of people I had loved and lost. "Come closer," they whispered. "See what we are." And the sound coiled inside my head until I could no longer distinguish between their words and my own thoughts. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me to the heart of the spiral, and as I stepped into it, the ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple like water, sending shivers through my body. The creatures formed a circle around me, their heads tilting in unison, watching, humming, guiding, pressing me into the altar's center as though I were the final element of some ritual I could not comprehend. Panic surged through me, and I tried to turn, to flee, but the forest had shifted again. The path back had vanished, replaced by trees bending impossibly close, roots twisting to block my way. I realized in that moment that escape was not an option, that they were not hunters nor pranksters, not predators in the sense I understood. They were something else, something older, something that existed beyond human laws of space and time. One of them lowered its head until its featureless face was close to mine, and for an instant I thought I felt it studying me, probing my mind, reading my memories as easily as flipping pages in a book. The hum surged, filling my ears, my chest, my skull, until I could no longer tell where I ended and where the sound began. And then the spiral shifted. Stones, bones, soil. They rose, slowly, impossibly, hovering a few inches above the ground as though the rhythm of the creature's humming had given them life. The creature's limbs stretched further, swaying and coiling, and I felt the pull of the spiral, an almost magnetic tug urging me to kneel, to merge with the pattern, to understand it from inside. My knees buckled, my hands pressed to the dirt, and I realized with a horror that I had no choice. They weren't attacking, not in any way I could see. They were assimilating, drawing me into their world, rewriting my perception until I could no longer separate reality from their design. I screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the hum, the vibration, the living geometry of the spiral, and I felt myself lifted, weightless, as if the earth itself was bending to accommodate them. My mind raced through every memory, every lesson, every warning I had read in Elias's journal, and yet it did nothing to stop it. I was a participant now, a node in their pattern, one element in a design I could not hope to understand. And then, Just as suddenly as it began, the pressure lifted. The figures receded into the shadows. The spiral collapsed back into the ground, and I found myself alone in the hollow, chest heaving, trembling, every nerve screaming. The forest was silent, unnaturally still, the hum gone. I staggered back toward the cabin, dazed, unsure whether I had survived or merely been permitted to leave. The clearing bore no signs of the spiral, no trace of the creatures. Yet I knew what had happened was real. I had touched their world and been touched in return, and part of me, something I could not name, remained behind, intertwined with the rhythm, the geometry, and the cold, patient intelligence that had orchestrated it all. That night I slept on the cabin floor, exhausted, but sleep brought no relief. Only the echo of that hum, faint beneath my eyelids, a reminder that I was no longer alone, not truly. The days that followed the encounter in the hollow were disorienting and suffocating, as though the forest had not released me, but rather folded itself around me in a way that followed me home. I returned to the cabin, though it no longer felt like mine. Every board, every shadow seemed altered, carrying traces of what had happened, remnants of a world I could no longer understand. Sleep eluded me, not because of fear of seeing them again. That was only part of it, but because in the quiet moments I could still hear the hum, faint but unmistakable, resonating inside my skull, a vibration that no ear could detect yet that filled my thoughts. I tried to leave again, desperately, insisting that the road would guide me out this time. But the same impossible twists awaited. Familiar landmarks vanished, paths doubled back, and I was left circling the cabin like a moth trapped in its own courtyard. The spirals appeared in new places, etched into the dirt outside the cabin, drawn into dust on the windowsills, even pressed faintly into my own clothes and skin, as though the creatures had followed me wherever I went. I began to notice other things, subtle at first. Shadows that moved independently of the light, branches that bent unnaturally to obscure my view, whispers that echoed in empty rooms. I tried to speak to myself, to ground myself in reason, but even my own voice seemed to bend, repeating in ways I didn't intend, answering questions I hadn't asked. My meals went untouched. I barely drank water, and yet I couldn't rest. My reflection in the windows seemed wrong, elongated subtly, as if the world itself had been stretched during my absence in the hollow. Letters and spirals pressed into the earth became more frequent, sometimes forming crude images, sometimes words: follow, see, know. I didn't want to, yet the compulsion to step outside and observe, to trace their patterns and attempt understanding, was irresistible. Every night the mimicry returned. Voices of friends, neighbors, even strangers I had never met whispered my name, called to me, coaxed me toward the edges of the forest. Sometimes my own voice answered back, before I could stop it, urging me forward, repeating the things the creatures wanted me to hear. I realized with mounting horror that they had not merely shown me their world, they had touched my mind, rewriting pathways I could not trace or resist. Even during the day, when the forest seemed calm, I sensed them at the periphery. The tilt of a tree, a shadow moving just beyond my vision, a faint vibration beneath my feet that suggested presence. I became meticulous, almost obsessive, cataloging every spiral, every mark, trying to understand, to anticipate, to reclaim some fragment of control. Yet control was an illusion. One afternoon, while tracing a spiral that had appeared near the edge of the clearing, I found a small, smooth stone pressed into the earth with my initials carved into it, letters I had never etched. Panic surged as I realized they could reach me anywhere, could manipulate not only the world around me, but the artifacts of my own life, leaving signs I could not ignore. I retreated into the cabin, barricading doors and windows, burning lamps and candles to fill every shadow with light, but the sense of being observed never left. By the third night, I could no longer tell whether the faint hum I heard beneath my pillow was from the earth, the air, or inside my own head. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and I feared even closing my eyes might allow them access to deeper corners of my mind. Something had changed in me. I was not the same. Every decision, every thought carried the weight of the hollow and the rhythm of their presence. Yet the pull remained, a magnetic draw toward the spirals, the patterns, the unseen ritual that had marked me as part of their design. I felt them when I slept, when I ate, when I moved, always just outside perception, teaching, testing, claiming. And though I tried to convince myself that I could resist, that reason and logic would shield me, deep down I knew it was useless. I had been touched by something ancient, patient, and infinitely more intelligent than I could comprehend. I had survived the hollow, but survival came at a cost. I was no longer fully human, no longer fully separate from the rhythm that pulsed through the forest, through the spirals, through me. And as the sun set behind the trees, casting long, unnatural shadows across the cabin floor, I heard it again, soft, patient, coaxing. And I understood that whatever had begun in the hollow was not finished, not by a long measure, and that the story was not mine to end. I cannot say for certain how long I have been here, in this cabin, in this clearing, in this forest that is no longer simply a forest, but a living, breathing extension of them. Time has lost its meaning. Hours, days, perhaps weeks or months pass in a blur, measured only by the shifting patterns of spirals that appear on the ground outside my door, pressed into dust, dirt, or stones, as if the earth itself conspires to remind me of their presence. The humming has never ceased, not entirely, only fluctuating in intensity, always just beneath the threshold of consciousness, threading its rhythm through my dreams, my thoughts, my blood. I have tried to leave countless times, each attempt ending the same. The path bends, the trees twist, the familiar becomes alien, and I find myself back at the cabin, back at the center of their orbit, helpless against the geometry of their world. My body is weary, my mind taut, yet there is a strange clarity now, a horrific understanding. They are patient, infinitely patient, and their purpose is beyond my comprehension. They do not hunt as humans do. They do not kill for hunger or sport. They seek understanding, or perhaps to impart understanding, using shapes, patterns, and resonance that the mind of a human can barely register. I have become part of their design, whether I accept it or not. The spirals press me inward. The symbols etch themselves onto memory. And sometimes, in moments of fleeting lucidity, I catch the faint outline of a shape at the edge of vision, longer than a man, thinner than a tree, watching. Last night, or what I recall as night, the mimicry returned in full force. Voices of people I have known, of those I have loved, of those long dead, called to me from beyond the walls, from the forest, from the very shadows. My own voice answered them, unwilling, unbidden, forming words I did not intend. I see. I whispered into the empty cabin, and it was echoed back in dozens of tones, rising in harmony, a choir of the impossible. The floorboards beneath me hummed faintly, vibrating with the resonance of their presence, and I understood then that resistance is futile. They do not need to take me. I am already theirs, inscribed into their rhythm, a part of the patterns they fold across the world. I rise each morning to find new arrangements, spirals of stones, carvings etched into the porch, patterns pressed into the dust of the floor. Sometimes I follow them into the forest, compelled to observe, to trace, to catalog, though I know it matters not. The lines twist, the paths bend, and I am returned to the cabin, changed. I have glimpsed the altar once more, though I do not linger. The memory of that night in the hollow is too vivid, too complete. I remember the hum, the lifting of the earth, the impossible geometry of their ritual, and the pull that drew me forward until I became a part of it. Even now, I feel that tug in my chest, an inexorable current leading me beyond what is safe, beyond what is human. I have begun to write again, though I know the words are meaningless, a record for no one, a warning for myself that will never be read. I record spirals, symbols, arrangements, descriptions of the shapes, the humming, the voices, because if I do not, I fear I might forget that part of myself that was once entirely human. The forest presses closer at all hours. Branches bend unnaturally. Shadows twist in impossible ways, and sometimes I swear the trees themselves lean to watch, to guide, to participate. The boundary between cabin and forest, between self and them, between reality and their design, has eroded entirely. I am no longer alone, not truly. Even when I am silent, even when I do not move, I can feel them, 1,000 invisible limbs brushing against the edges of perception. Occasionally, I glimpse them in the corner of my eye, taller than trees, stretching impossibly, moving in ways that defy understanding. And yet, I cannot look directly. I know what the journals warned. Do not look at their faces. I have resisted for now, and perhaps that is why I remain. But I know the pull is growing stronger, the spirals multiplying, the hum never fading. There is no escape, not in this world, not in any measure of time I can comprehend. I am theirs, marked, inscribed, part of the design, and yet I remain conscious enough to record this. Let these words stand as the last trace of who I was, though I know the forest may swallow them, may erase them, may fold them into the rhythm. I cannot leave, and even if I could, I would not be free. The creatures, whatever they are, however old, however patient, are patient still. I feel their presence now in the shadows beyond the windows, in the wind through the trees, in the hum beneath the floorboards. I write this because I have no other recourse, because to stop writing would be to stop resisting entirely. And yet, as I look toward the forest, I know the truth. They are patient, and they are coming, always waiting, always watching. And when the time is right, I will step into the spiral once more, not as an intruder, not as a victim, but as a part of their design, forever inscribed in the rhythm of the forest, in the geometry of the earth, in the quiet, unending hum that is now a part of me.